Autumn 1944. A German anti-tank position, or the turret of a German tank, somewhere on the Western Front. And a German gunner is looking through his sight at an American Sherman tank, and he is about to do something he has done many times before, something he is very good at. He is about to destroy it. He has the better gun. He has, very likely, the better tank or the better anti-tank weapon. And at this range, against this target, he will probably win. He fires. And the Sherman is hit, and burns, or stops, and he counts it as a kill, and he is right to. And then, a day later, or a week later, the Shermans come again. And there seem to be just as many as before, and some of the men in them, he cannot know this for certain, but he suspects it, and he is often right, are the same men, the crews who bailed out of the tanks he killed, back again in new tanks, coming at him once more. And he kills some of those too, and they keep coming, and no matter how many he destroys, there are always more tanks, and more crews, and the same faces, it seems, that he is sure he killed last week, back in the fight, as though death itself could not hold them. And the German gunner, who knows perfectly well that his gun is better, and his tank is better, and he is winning every individual duel, begins to feel something that is almost superstitious, almost supernatural, and that German tank crews really did express in something like these terms. The American Sherman refused to die. You could kill it, easily, often, and it would not stay dead. You destroyed them, and they kept coming, in the same numbers, with the same crews, as though the enemy had discovered some secret of resurrection, as though the Shermans rose from their own wreckage and came at you again. Now, there was nothing supernatural about it, of course, but the feeling pointed at something real, and something that this channel has circled many times, because it is the deepest truth of the war, that the Germans won the individual duels and lost the war anyway, because the enemy could replace what it lost, the tanks and, crucially, the men, faster than the Germans could destroy them. The Sherman refused to die, not because any individual Sherman was hard to kill, it often was not, but because the system behind it was effectively immortal, producing new tanks and preserving and returning the crews faster than the German guns could reduce them. This is not a story about a tank that would not die. This is a forensic audit of why the American Sherman seemed immortal to the men who kept killing it, of the overwhelming numbers, the crew survivability, and the swift replacement that made a killable tank into an unkillable force, and of why, in a long war, the force that cannot be killed defeats the tank that can, however many individual duels the better tank wins. Part 1. The German Calculus. To understand why the Sherman seemed to refuse to die, you have to start where the German gunner started, with the entirely correct belief that he could kill it, and kill it easily, because in the matter of the individual duel, the Germans genuinely were superior. We have discussed the German tanks and anti-tank weapons before, and their quality was real. The heavy German tanks, the Panthers and Tigers, had guns and armor superior to the Shermans, and could destroy a Sherman at ranges from which the Sherman could not effectively reply. The German anti-tank guns were superb. In the individual engagement, tank against tank or gun against tank, the Germans very often held the advantage, and a skilled German gunner could rack up an impressive tally of destroyed Shermans, because the Sherman was, by the standards of the heavy German machines, relatively easy to kill. Its armor was thinner, it was vulnerable to the German guns. When hit, it often burned. On the narrow question of, can I destroy this individual tank, the German gunner was frequently right to be confident. So the German calculus began with genuine, justified confidence in the individual duel. And this confidence was not misplaced. The Germans really did destroy Shermans in large numbers, really did win a favorable exchange rate in individual engagements, really were superior in the tank versus tank duel. If the war had been a series of individual duels, the Germans would have won it. But the war was not a series of individual duels, and here the German calculus began to break down, because the things that made the Sherman refuse to die were not qualities of the individual tank at all. They were qualities of the system behind the tank, and the German gunner, focused on the target in his sight, could not see them, and could not do anything about them. The first thing he could not see was the sheer number of Shermans, We have discussed American mass production, and the Sherman was its supreme expression, built in tens of thousands, in numbers that dwarfed German tank production many times over. For every Sherman the German gunner destroyed, there were many more, and the American ability to produce and deliver replacement tanks was so vast that losses which would have crippled the German army were, for the Americans, routinely absorbed and replaced. The German gunner destroyed real tanks, but he was trying to empty an ocean with a bucket, because behind every Sherman he killed were 10 more coming off the ships and the trains and the transporters. The second thing he could not fully see, but sometimes suspected, was that the crews were surviving and returning. And this is the crucial and less understood part of the story, because it is about men, not machines, and it is the deepest reason the Sherman refused to die. When a Sherman was hit, its crew had a remarkably good chance of surviving, of bailing out alive, being recovered, and living to fight another day. And a surviving, experienced crew is far more valuable than the tank itself, because the tank can be replaced from the factory in days, but the trained crew embodies irreplaceable experience. The American system preserved its tank crews to a remarkable degree, so that the destruction of a tank often did not mean the destruction of its crew, and the same experienced men returned again and again in new tanks. The German gunner who felt he was killing the same crews over and over was often literally correct. He was destroying the tanks, but the men were surviving and coming back. That is the German calculus. Genuine, justified superiority in the individual duel. The German gunner really could kill the Sherman, and did in large numbers, combined with a total inability to affect the two things that actually mattered, the overwhelming number of replacement tanks and the survival and return of the crews. He won every duel and could not win the war, because the Sherman he kept killing was backed by a system that produced new tanks faster than he could destroy them and preserved the crews he thought he had killed. Now let us look at the two things that made the Sherman immortal. Part 2. The American Answer. The Sherman's apparent immortality rested on two pillars, and neither of them was the individual tank's combat power. They were first, the overwhelming numbers produced by American industry, and second, the survivability and replacement of the crews. Together, these made a killable tank into an unkillable force. Consider the numbers first, because they are staggering, and they are the foundation. The Sherman was designed, as we have discussed, for mass production. Simple enough to build, reliable enough to keep running, standardized enough to maintain, that it could be produced in enormous quantities. And the Sherman was built in the tens of thousands, in numbers that made it one of the most produced tanks of the war, dwarfing the production of the heavy German tanks many times over. This meant that the American army could absorb tank losses that would have been catastrophic for the Germans, and simply replace them. A German gunner might destroy several Shermans, and it would barely register against the flood of replacements, because the American production and delivery system could put new tanks into the field faster than the German guns could destroy the old ones. The individual Sherman was killable. The endless supply of Shermans was not. But numbers alone are only half the story, and the deeper half is the crews. Because a tank is not just a machine, it is 5 trained men, and the men are far harder to replace than the machine. And here the Sherman had a quality that is often overlooked in the endless debates about its armor and its gun. It was, in important respects, a survivable tank for its crew. Its layout, its escape hatches, and, critically, after a key improvement made during the war, the protection of its ammunition, gave the Sherman crew a good chance of getting out alive when the tank was hit. This matters enormously, and here is why. Early in the Sherman's career, it had a dangerous tendency to catch fire when hit, because of how its ammunition was stored, and this cost crews their lives. But the Americans identified the problem and fixed it, introducing wet stowage, storing the ammunition in water-protected containers that dramatically reduced the risk of catastrophic fire. After this improvement, a hit Sherman was far less likely to become a death trap, and far more likely to let its crew bail out alive. The result was that Sherman crews, even when their tanks were destroyed, survived at a remarkable rate. They got out, were recovered, and lived to fight again. And this crew survivability, combined with the endless supply of replacement tanks, is what created the phenomenon of the Sherman that refused to die. When a Sherman was knocked out, very often the crew survived. A new tank was available almost immediately from the vast supply. And so the same experienced crew, in a new tank, was back in the fight within days. From the German gunner's perspective, this looked like immortality. He destroyed the tank, and days later, the same men were back, in a new tank, coming at him again. He was not imagining it. The tanks were being replaced from the endless supply, and the crews were surviving and returning, and the combination meant that no matter how many Shermans he destroyed, the American armored force regenerated itself faster than he could reduce it. There are documented cases that make this concrete and almost unbelievable. American tank crews who were knocked out more than once, who lost tank after tank to German fire, and who climbed into a new Sherman each time and went back into battle. A crew might lose one tank in one engagement, draw a replacement soon after, and be back in the fight within days. Over a campaign, a single experienced crew might go through several tanks, surviving each knockout, growing more experienced even as they lost machine after machine. To the German gunner on the other side, this was indistinguishable from fighting an enemy who could not be killed, because the machines he destroyed were quickly replaced, and the men he thought he had finished kept reappearing, hardened and more experienced each time, in yet another new tank. Consider what this meant strategically. The value of destroying an enemy tank comes from the permanent reduction of his combat power. You destroy the tank, and his force is smaller. But against the Sherman, this logic broke down, because the destruction was not permanent. The tank was replaced within days, the crew often survived, and so the German gunner's kill, real as it was, produced only a temporary reduction that the American system immediately made good. He was fighting an enemy who could regenerate his losses almost as fast as they were inflicted, and against such an enemy, winning individual duels is not enough, because the duels do not accumulate into a decisive advantage. The enemy keeps replacing what he loses, and the war grinds on until the side that cannot replace its losses, which was Germany, is finally worn away. The Americans did not build a Sherman that could not be killed. They built a Sherman force that could not be killed. Through overwhelming numbers that replaced every lost tank, and crew survivability that preserved the irreplaceable men, so that the individual killable tank became part of an immortal force, regenerating itself faster than the finest German gunners could destroy it. Part 3. The River of Steel. The immortality of the Sherman force connects directly to the central themes of this channel, and it is one of the clearest illustrations of them, because it shows so precisely how the Germans could win every battle and lose the war. It connects, first, to the theme of the system versus the individual weapon, which runs through everything we have examined. The Sherman is the perfect case study, because the individual Sherman was inferior, genuinely killable, genuinely outmatched in the duel, and yet the Sherman force was superior because of the system behind it. This is the whole argument of the channel in a single weapon. The war was decided not by the quality of the individual machine, but by the capacity of the system to produce, replace, and sustain, and the Sherman force, immortal through numbers and crew survival, defeated the superior German tanks through systemic regeneration rather than individual quality. It connects to the theme of mass production and numbers as a quality in their own right. We have argued throughout that quantity, at a sufficient scale, becomes a quality, that overwhelming numbers change what is possible and cannot be overcome by individual excellence. The Sherman proves it. The endless supply of Shermans was not just a quantitative advantage, it was a qualitative transformation that made the American armored force effectively unkillable, able to absorb any losses and keep coming. The German gunner faced not a number of tanks, but an inexhaustible supply, and that inexhaustibility was itself a war-winning quality. It connects to the theme of valuing and preserving the individual man, which we have found throughout the American way of war. The crew survivability of the Sherman, the escape hatches, the wet stowage, the whole design emphasis on getting the crew out alive, reflected the same philosophy we have seen in the medical system, the winter equipment, the food, and everything else, the conviction that the individual man was worth preserving. And here that philosophy had a direct strategic payoff, because preserving the crews meant preserving the irreplaceable experience, so that the American armored force grew more experienced over time, even as it absorbed losses, while the German force bled away its irreplaceable veterans. The care for the crew was not just humane, it was war-winning. And it connects to the deepest theme of all, that in a long war, the decisive question is not who wins the individual battles, but who can sustain and regenerate their force over time. The Germans won the duels, the Americans won the war, and the difference was regeneration, the ability to replace lost tanks and preserve lost crews faster than they could be destroyed. The Sherman that refused to die is the emblem of this truth. It could be killed, easily, again and again, and it did not matter, because the force it belonged to regenerated faster than it could be reduced, and a force that regenerates faster than it can be destroyed cannot be defeated, however many of its individual tanks are killed. The German gunner, killing Shermans and watching them come again, was living the central truth of the war, that he could win every duel and still lose, because the enemy's strength was not in the individual tank he kept killing, but in the immortal, regenerating system behind it, which no amount of individual killing could exhaust. Part 4. The German Realization. The realization that came to the German gunner and to the German army about the Sherman was one of the most demoralizing of the entire war, precisely because it rendered their genuine superiority meaningless. The immediate realization was the futility of the kills. A German gunner could destroy Shermans in large numbers, could win an impressive personal tally, could dominate the individual duels, and it did not seem to matter. The Shermans kept coming, in the same numbers, and the ground was not won, and the enemy was not weakened in any lasting way. There is a particular demoralization in fighting well, winning your battles, achieving real successes, and watching them accomplish nothing, because the enemy simply replaces his losses and comes again. The German gunner's skill was real, and his kills were real, and their strategic effect was nearly nil, and understanding that was a bitter thing. The deeper realization was about the two things behind the Sherman's immortality, the numbers and the crews, and the German inability to affect either. The Germans understood that they were outnumbered in tanks, overwhelmingly, and that American production dwarfed their own. And the more perceptive among them understood the crew survival factor too, that the enemy's crews were bailing out and returning, that the experience was being preserved, that they were fighting the same men again and again. And they understood that they could do nothing about either factor. They could not outproduce American industry. They could not stop the enemy's crews from surviving and returning. They could only keep killing Shermans, futilely, as the immortal force regenerated itself faster than they could reduce it. And there was a particularly bitter dimension, which was the contrast with their own situation. When a German tank was destroyed, it was a catastrophe, because it could not easily be replaced. German production was limited, and every lost Tiger or Panther was a grievous, hard-to-make-good loss. And when a German crew was lost, it was worse, because the irreplaceable experienced crews were exactly what Germany could not replace. So the Germans were in the reverse situation from the Americans. Their losses were permanent and crippling, while the enemy's losses were temporary and quickly regenerated. Every exchange, even a favorable one, hurt the Germans more than the Americans, because the Germans could not replace what they lost, and the Americans could. The German gunner destroying Shermans was winning the duels and losing the attrition, because his own inevitable losses were permanent while the enemy's were not. And the deepest German realization was the familiar one, delivered through the immortal Sherman. They were being beaten not because their tanks were inferior, their tanks were superior, but because the enemy's system could regenerate faster than the German quality could destroy. The whole German bet, the whole German way of war, was on superior quality in the individual weapon. And the Sherman proved that this bet was lost, because superior individual quality, however real, could not overcome an enemy who replaced his losses faster than they could be inflicted. The Germans had built the better tank and were losing to the worse one, because the worse one belonged to an immortal force and the better one did not. The German gunner, watching the Shermans he had killed come again, understood in the end that he was fighting something he could not defeat. Not a better tank, which he could kill, but an immortal system, which he could not. And there is no more demoralizing realization available to a soldier than that his skill and his superior weapons are futile against an enemy who simply will not stay dead. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle crewed a Sherman, perhaps bailed out of one that was hit, survived, and climbed into another to fight again, or built them in the great American factories, or recovered and repaired them to return them to the fight, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. The Sherman crews fought in a tank that was often outgunned, and they knew it, and they climbed in anyway, and many of them were hit and bailed out and went back, again and again. That took a particular and extraordinary kind of courage, and the survivability that let them return was one of the quiet reasons the war was won. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war ends, and the Sherman, the tank the German gunners could kill so easily and could not stop, has helped win it, not by being unkillable, but by belonging to a force that was. So here is the verdict. The German gunners swore the Sherman refused to die not because the individual Sherman was hard to kill, it often was not, and they destroyed them in large numbers, winning the individual duels with their superior tanks and guns. The Sherman refused to die because the force it belonged to was effectively immortal, regenerating itself through two things the German gunner could neither see clearly nor do anything about: the overwhelming numbers that replaced every destroyed tank almost immediately, and the crew survivability that preserved the irreplaceable men and returned them to the fight. The individual Sherman was killable, the Sherman force was not, and that distinction is the whole truth of the war, because the Germans kept killing the individual tank and could not touch the immortal force, and so their genuine superiority in the duel accomplished nothing, while the American system regenerated faster than the German guns could reduce it. The verdict is the one this channel has reached from every direction, delivered here through the tank that would not stay dead. The Germans built the better individual weapon and lost, because the war was not decided by the individual weapon, but by the capacity to produce, replace, and sustain. And in that capacity, the Americans were overwhelming. The Sherman that refused to die was the emblem of the whole war. A killable tank, killed again and again, belonging to an unkillable force that regenerated faster than it could be destroyed, until the side that could not replace its losses was finally worn away. The Germans could kill the Sherman. They could not kill the force behind it, the endless supply of new tanks, the surviving and returning crews, the immortal regenerating system, and in a long war, the force that cannot be killed defeats the tank that can. However many duels the better tank wins. The German gunner won his battles and lost his war, killing Shermans that would not stay dead, until the immortal force behind them had ground his own irreplaceable strength to nothing. And that is why the Sherman refused to die, not because any Sherman was hard to kill, but because behind every one the German destroyed stood 10 more, and the same men, coming again. An enemy who had learned that you win a long war, not by being unkillable, but by being unkillable as a force, however killable you are as a single tank. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these, more systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the tank that would not die. Nobody makes a film about the regenerating system, about the endless supply of replacement tanks and the crews who bailed out and came back. The films are about the great duels, the Tiger picking off Shermans at long range, the superior German machine dominating the battlefield. And those duels were real, and the Germans often won them. But the Sherman kept coming. Killed and killed and killed, and it would not stay dead, because behind it was something the German gunner could not destroy, a nation that could build tanks faster than he could kill them, and that got its crews out alive to fight again, so that the same men came back in new tanks, week after week, as though death could not hold them. Mostly, when a Sherman was destroyed, the crew got out, and a new tank was waiting, and they climbed in and went back, and the force that the German gunner was trying to destroy regenerated faster than he could reduce it, until his own irreplaceable strength was gone. They deserve to be remembered, the Sherman crews who were hit and survived and went back, and the industry that gave them another tank to climb into, by the hard truth that they won, not because their tank could not be killed, but because they could not be stopped. An immortal force of killable tanks that refused, in the end, to die.